What happens when the world you thought you knew suddenly unravels? For Elijah, a bright but misunderstood teenager, it began with a day he would never forget. A simple walk home from school turned into a nightmare when Elijah was wrongfully implicated in a robbery near his school, a crime he had nothing to do with. But no one believed him. The system, quick to judge and slow to listen, sentenced him to a life behind bars, all because of a mistake no one cared to fix. Meanwhile, Lily, a rising legal star, was fighting her own battle against her father. The man she once admired as a symbol of justice had become the very person she had to expose. When Lily discovered her father's corruption, she couldn't stand by in silence. With her own career on the line, she made the brave choice to stand up and speak the truth, even if it meant tearing apart everything she had ever known. Two people, caught in battles of their own, but connected by a shared desire for justice. Could their paths ever cross? And if they did, could they fight a broken system together? Stay with us as we uncover a tale of courage, redemption, and the power of speaking out. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're tuning in from. Is it sunny or snowing where you are? If it's cold, make sure to bundle up, grab a cup of hot tea, and enjoy today's story with your loved ones. And don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories to come. Elijah Carter was an 18-year-old high school student living in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. His life had always been shaped by the streets he grew up on, where opportunities were few, and every day felt like a battle to stay afloat. Raised by his single mother, Linda, Elijah had learned early on that hard work and perseverance were the keys to survival. But as much as he tried to stay out of trouble, the system seemed determined to bring him down. He was a good kid at heart, often volunteering at the local community center and helping his neighbors with odd jobs. But like many young men of color, Elijah found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. One evening, he was mistakenly caught up in a robbery that occurred near his school. It wasn't his fault, but when the police arrived, Elijah became the prime suspect, primarily because of his background. Despite his mother's pleas and his clean record, the case was handled swiftly, and Elijah was sent to juvenile detention on charges that seemed grossly inflated. The legal system had failed him, and the wheels of justice seemed to turn in a way that had nothing to do with truth, only with assumptions and biases. Lily Foster, on the other hand, had lived a life of privilege. She grew up in a well-to-do family, the daughter of Judge Charles Bennett, a respected figure in the judicial community. Lily had always believed in the fairness of the justice system, trusting that her father, a man who upheld the law with unwavering conviction, would ensure that justice was served. Her world had been one of order and certainty, until Elijah Carter's case shattered her illusion of the legal system's fairness. Lily had always been close to her father, spending weekends at his office, watching him work tirelessly on his cases, and absorbing his lessons on the importance of upholding justice. She admired him, perhaps even idolized him, believing that his decisions were based solely on facts and the law. But when Elijah's case came across her father's desk, something began to nag at her. She noticed the patterns, the racial disparities in the sentencing decisions, the quick judgments made based on the color of a person's skin rather than the details of their case. As her father continued to hand down harsh sentences, Lily started to question the very foundation of the system she had once trusted. It wasn't until the day Elijah Carter was sentenced that Lily felt a deep, uncomfortable tug in her conscience. She had been present in the courtroom when the verdict was delivered, watching as Elijah, a young man she had never met, was sent away with what seemed like an unjustly long sentence. The court had painted him as a hardened criminal, yet she saw only a frightened teenager in the defendant's chair. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and in that fleeting glance, she saw the fear and confusion of someone who didn't deserve to be there. Lily's heart sank, and she left the courthouse that day with more questions than answers. As the weeks passed, Lily's doubts grew. She began to dig into her father's rulings, poring over old cases, reviewing sentencing patterns, and conducting her own research. What she discovered disturbed her, a shocking pattern of racial bias in her father's decisions. It wasn't just Elijah's case, it was hundreds of others. The system was broken, and Lily realized that her father, a man she had always respected, was part of the problem. Elijah's time in juvenile detention marked a turning point in his life. The once confident teenager was now a shadow of his former self, his bright eyes dulled by the harsh reality of the system that had failed him. The 3 months he spent behind bars felt like an eternity, but it was during that time that Elijah decided he wasn't going to let the system define him. He would fight back, not just for himself, but for others who had been wronged like him. The injustice he experienced became the fuel for his resolve, and he began to form a plan for the future. A future where he would make sure no one else had to suffer in silence. But back in the world outside, Lily was also beginning to grapple with the uncomfortable truth of her father's role in perpetuating the injustice Elijah had endured. She had always believed that the law was black and white, that justice was an unassailable force. But now she saw the gray areas, the moments where bias crept in unnoticed, where people like Elijah were sentenced more harshly simply because of their skin color. As Lily began to question everything she had once believed in, she realized that the only way to change things was to confront the truth. She couldn't stand by and let the system continue to harm innocent people, not when she had the power to do something about it. But her journey was just beginning, and the road ahead would be far from easy. The paths of Elijah and Lily were now intertwined, though they didn't yet know it. Lily's quest for justice would lead her to Elijah, and Elijah's fight for redemption would eventually bring him face to face with the very system that had failed him. Together, they would become the catalyst for a movement that would change everything. But first, they had to confront their own biases, their own truths, and the undeniable injustice of a broken system. Lily Foster stood at the window of her apartment, the skyline of the city stretching before her. The sun had just set, casting a warm golden light across the buildings. But inside, Lily felt nothing but cold. The weight of the decision she had made was bearing down on her, and she was no longer sure if she could carry it. The truth had a way of settling in her chest, heavy and unforgiving. For days now, she had wrestled with herself, torn between her loyalty to her father, the man who had raised her with such love and pride, and the overwhelming knowledge that he had been part of a system that had destroyed lives. She had seen the evidence with her own eyes, the racial bias, the disproportionate sentences, the way the law seemed to bend and twist around those who weren't white, those who didn't have the right connections. And the more she learned, the more she realized that her father had been one of the key players in perpetuating that injustice. It wasn't just one case. It wasn't just Elijah's story. It was hundreds of others. Cases where young people, particularly people of color, were handed sentences far harsher than they deserved. Lily had compiled all the data, every pattern, every piece of evidence that showed the depth of the systemic bias her father had helped enforce. She knew that if she exposed the truth, her world would crumble. Her father's career, his reputation, his legacy, it would all be over. And her relationship with him? She didn't know if they could survive it. But the truth was insistent. It called to her, louder and clearer with each passing day. Lily had been taught her entire life that justice was about doing what was right, not what was easy. But now, standing at the edge of this precipice, she wasn't sure if she was ready to take that leap. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, breaking her reverie. She didn't need to check it to know who it was. Her mother, Rebecca Ellis, had been trying to call for hours. Lily hesitated before picking it up, the weight of the conversation that awaited her hanging in the air. Lily, her mother's voice came through the receiver, calm but laced with concern. Your father, he's not taking this well. He knows you've been looking into his cases. I don't want you to go down this road. It's going to ruin everything. You're his daughter. He loves you. I love him too, Mom, Lily replied, her voice soft, though there was no mistaking the resolve in it. But this is bigger than him. This is bigger than us. People's lives have been ruined because of his decisions. I can't stand by and let that continue. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, her mother spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You're making a choice you can't undo, Lily. Once you go public with this, there's no going back. Lily looked at the case files spread out on her dining table, thick stacks of paper that documented years of injustice. She had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to stay silent. It was time to testify. The day of the hearing arrived quickly, as if the universe itself was pushing her toward this moment, this reckoning. Lily had already prepared herself for what she was about to do, but as she stepped into the courthouse, her heart pounded in her chest. The air inside felt heavy, suffocating. This wasn't just a hearing. It was a battle for truth, for justice, and for a future she wasn't sure she would have. The board was already seated when Lily entered the room. She could see the familiar faces of some of the key figures in the judicial system, people who had been part of her life for years. They all knew her, but none of them knew the woman who was about to testify. None of them knew the depth of the decision she had made. She wasn't just a daughter about to betray her father. She was a woman determined to fight for the innocent, to expose the truth no matter the cost. As Lily sat down to face the board, her eyes briefly flickered toward the back of the room, where her father sat, his presence looming. Judge Charles Bennett, a man who had shaped her entire understanding of justice, was now the defendant in a case that could destroy his career. He looked different today. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a stiffness that made him seem older, smaller. But there was no mistake in his eyes. He knew what was coming. "Miss Bennett," the board's chairwoman said, her voice steady, but with a hint of curiosity. "You've asked to speak today regarding the investigation into your father's rulings. Please, tell us what you have discovered." Lily took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the folder of evidence before the board. She could feel her father's gaze on her, burning through her, but she pushed it aside. She had a duty to these people, to the victims who had been forgotten, and to herself. This wasn't about him. It was about righting the wrongs that had been done. "Thank you," Lily began, her voice clear despite the nerves running through her. "What I'm about to share isn't easy for me. I have spent my entire life believing in the system my father helped build, in the fairness of the courts and the righteousness of the law. But over the past few months, I've come to realize that what I believed was a lie." She paused, letting her words settle in the room. She knew the weight of what she was saying, the gravity of the moment. She wasn't just exposing her father's mistakes, she was tearing apart the foundation of everything she had known. "Through my research, I have found a disturbing pattern," she continued, keeping her eyes on the board members. "Judge Bennett, in his rulings over the past decade, has handed down harsher sentences to minority youths, particularly Black and Latino young people, than to their white counterparts for similar crimes. I have personally reviewed over 400 of his cases, and the evidence is undeniable. His actions have contributed to a system that disproportionately punishes people based on the color of their skin, not the merit of their actions." She could hear her father shifting behind her, the tension in the room rising as her words settled in. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt, but she could feel the weight of his disappointment and his anger radiating off him. The silence between them was deafening. "This isn't just about one man's mistakes," Lily continued, her voice gaining strength. "This is about a broken system that allows injustice to thrive. My father has played a part in that. But he is not the only one. This system needs to change." As Lily spoke, she could see the impact of her testimony beginning to unfold. The board members exchanged looks, their expressions a mixture of surprise, disbelief, and, perhaps, guilt. They had suspected something, but hearing it out loud from someone so close to the case made it undeniable. The investigation would be launched. Judge Bennett's actions would be scrutinized, and every case he had presided over in the past decade would be reviewed. The ripple effect of Lily's decision had begun. There was no going back now. In the days following Lily's testimony, news of the investigation broke, sending shockwaves through the legal community. The State Judicial Review Board had launched a full-scale inquiry into the fairness of Judge Bennett's rulings, and soon, over 400 cases would be reviewed for evidence of racial bias. Lily had done it. She had exposed the truth. But as the media attention swirled around her, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. The fight for justice was just beginning, and now, her father's legacy was on the line. But despite the tension and the fear, Lily knew she had done the right thing. It was the first step toward a future where the system could be fixed, where people like Elijah Carter would no longer be treated as criminals before they even had a chance to prove their innocence. It wasn't over yet, but this was the turning point. The world would never look at Judge Bennett, or the system, quite the same way again. Judge Charles Bennett stood before the mirror in his modest apartment, The man who once commanded a courtroom with unwavering authority, now looking unrecognizable to himself. His suit, once a symbol of his power and success, now felt like a prison, a constant reminder of everything he had lost. The once sturdy foundation of his career had crumbled to dust, and the shockwaves from the investigation into his racial bias reverberated far beyond his professional life. In the span of just a few weeks, his reputation had been torn apart. The board had conducted their investigation, and the results were damning. Dozens of his rulings had been overturned, and the public outcry was deafening. News outlets, political figures, and social activists had all turned their attention to the shocking revelations of his discriminatory practices. His once glorious tenure as a judge had ended in disgrace. But the real blow hadn't come from the public backlash. It had come from within his own family. The silence between him and Lily had grown so deep that it was now a chasm he could never cross. He had always believed that his dedication to the law had been enough, that his commitment to his family had justified his harsh decisions in the courtroom. But now, as he sat in the dim light of his apartment, he realized how wrong he had been. The law could be rigid and inflexible, but family, love, and respect were fluid, delicate things. And he had lost them. Every night, Judge Bennett found himself replaying the moments that had led him here. The cases he had mishandled, the people he had condemned, the countless lives that had been damaged or destroyed by his biased judgments. He remembered Elijah Carter's face clearly, the young man whose life he had ruined without a second thought. Elijah had stood before him, a teenager with no voice, no power, and Judge Bennett had wielded his gavel as if it were the final word on a life. Now, in the quiet of his apartment, Judge Bennett understood the weight of that gavel. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was his wife, Patricia. Her presence had been a comfort to him during the darkest days of his fall, but even she had begun to withdraw. She no longer looked at him the way she once had, and he could feel the distance growing between them, an invisible wall erected by the actions of the man she had once trusted above all else. "William," Patricia's voice was soft, cautious as she entered the apartment. "We need to talk." He turned to face her, feeling the weight of her gaze. She had been by his side for decades, supporting him as he climbed the ranks of the judicial system. But now, he saw the cracks in their relationship, cracks that had always been there but had only now become impossible to ignore. "I know," he said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "I don't know how I got here, Pat. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was blind. I've been blind for so long." Rebecca sighed and sat beside him, her eyes filled with both sorrow and understanding. "We both were," she said, her tone heavy with a quiet pain. "I stood by you because I believed in you. But now I'm not sure who you are anymore." He closed his eyes, feeling the sting of her words. "I don't know if I can fix this," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I don't know if Lily will ever forgive me." Patricia's hand rested gently on his, a small gesture of comfort. "You have to try, William. But don't just try for her. You have to try for yourself, too. You've lost a lot, but you still have a chance to make things right." The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of their unspoken truths. Judge Bennett realized that this was no longer about regaining his career or his status. This was about redemption, about looking at himself in the mirror and finding something to respect again. But the path ahead was unclear, and the road to forgiveness was long and uncertain. Elijah Carter had spent 5 long years in the cold, sterile confines of juvenile detention, but now, as he walked out through the heavy doors, it felt as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He was free, finally free, but the feeling was bittersweet. The journey to this moment had been long and painful, filled with struggles that had left scars on his soul. Now, standing on the other side of those gates, Elijah wasn't sure who he was anymore, or what the future held for him. The first thing he noticed was the familiar smell of fresh air, the scent of freedom. The sun was shining brightly, and for the first time in years, he could feel the warmth on his skin. But as he stepped forward, he felt a gnawing emptiness in his chest, a hole that couldn't be filled by his newfound freedom alone. He had lost so much in these 5 years: time, youth, innocence, and nothing could bring that back. Waiting for him outside the detention center was his mother, Linda. Linda had been his rock throughout this journey, the one constant in his life. She had fought for him, believed in him when no one else did, and now, as he walked toward her, he could feel the depth of her love and pain. She had spent the last 5 years fighting the system, advocating for other wrongly convicted youths, all while keeping her son's memory alive in her heart. When Elijah saw his mother, he broke into a run. He hadn't realized how much he missed her until this very moment. As they embraced, Linda's arms tightened around him, as though she could somehow protect him from the world that had wronged him. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered through tears. "I knew you'd make it. I knew you'd come back to me." Elijah held her tightly, not sure what to say. Words seemed insufficient, inadequate to express everything he was feeling. The anger, the betrayal, the fear of what came next. It was all there, a tangled mess inside him. But in that moment, with his mother in his arms, he knew that he wasn't alone. He had someone who loved him, someone who had never given up on him, and that was enough to carry him through whatever came next. "Mom, I don't know how to do this," he confessed, pulling away slightly to look her in the eyes. "I don't know how to start over." Linda smiled softly, brushing the hair out of his face. "You don't have to do it alone, Elijah. We'll figure it out together, one step at a time." And so, the journey began. Elijah had a long road ahead of him, but with his mother by his side, he knew he could face whatever challenges lay in the future. His past wasn't something he could ever forget, but it didn't have to define him. This was a new chapter, and for the first time in a long while, Elijah felt like he had the chance to write his own story. As the two of them walked down the path together, hand in hand, Elijah allowed himself a small glimmer of hope. The healing had just begun, and while the scars of his past would always be with him, they no longer controlled his future. He was free. The weight of their past actions hung heavily over Elijah and Lily. Each was searching for redemption, but in their own way. For Elijah, it was a journey toward reclaiming his sense of self. A teenager who had spent years unjustly incarcerated, his world had been turned upside down, and the process of healing was far from simple. He couldn't erase the trauma of his detention, nor the anger that had built up from the years spent fighting against a system that had failed him. But he was determined to speak out, to use his voice in ways that could inspire change for others like him. His first step came when he shared his story in local communities, speaking to high school students, activists, and civil rights groups. Every time he told his story, it felt like a small part of the injustice he had suffered was lifted from his shoulders. Yet, there was always the reminder. No matter how much he shared, the scars would remain. But he spoke not just for himself, but for the countless others whose stories went unheard. It wasn't long before his efforts were noticed. One afternoon, as he was preparing to leave a speech at a community center, he received an email that would shift the trajectory of his life. It was an internship offer from a prominent civil rights organization that focused on justice reform and fighting racial bias within the legal system. The offer felt surreal. Just a few months ago, Elijah had been the boy sentenced to juvenile detention for a crime he didn't commit, and now he was being invited to join the fight for justice. With a deep breath, he accepted the offer. The internship wasn't just a job. It was a symbol of his fight, of the future he was now working to create. He moved into a small, modest apartment in the city to be closer to the organization's headquarters. It was a new beginning, but also a reminder that the fight was far from over. Every day, Elijah threw himself into his work, attending protests, drafting policy suggestions, and working alongside legal experts who shared his vision of reform. In many ways, this internship was a healing process, allowing Elijah to channel his pain and anger into meaningful work. Meanwhile, Lily was on her own path toward redemption. After exposing her father's judicial biases, Lily felt conflicted. She had done what she believed was right, but at what cost? Her relationship with her father, once built on admiration and love, was now strained. Judge Bennett, her father, had always been her hero, the man who taught her about justice and fairness. But the truth she had uncovered had shattered that ideal. Lily had spent years believing in the justice system, believing in her father's ability to uphold it. Yet, the more she uncovered about his biased rulings, particularly against young black men like Elijah, the more she had to confront the painful reality that those ideals were flawed. Her father's name, once synonymous with authority, now stood for something she couldn't reconcile with the values she had been raised to uphold. Instead of retreating into silence, Lily threw herself into her work. She joined the Innocence Project, a non-profit organization that focused on exonerating wrongfully convicted individuals. Every case she worked on, every person she helped, gave her purpose. It was her way of atoning for the wrongs done under the banner of justice, and the more successful she became in freeing innocent people, the more she realized that true justice had very little to do with the courtroom. It was about understanding, empathy, and accountability. She spent countless hours reviewing case files, speaking with prisoners, and gathering evidence. Lily began to build a reputation as a passionate advocate for reform, and soon, she was involved in reviewing cases similar to Elijah's. Her role in the Innocence Project became increasingly critical, especially as she advocated for the exoneration of those unjustly convicted due to the same systemic biases that had led to Elijah's detention. It wasn't just the cases she worked on that mattered to Lily. It was the transformation she saw in herself. She had once lived in the shadow of her father's career, but now she was carving out her own identity, fighting for what was right, regardless of her father's legacy. Her work became her redemption, a way to rebuild her own moral compass after years of living in the shadow of a flawed system. For Judge Bennett, redemption came in a different form. After the investigation into his actions led to his suspension from the bench, he was forced to confront the full extent of his biases. He had spent years on the bench, issuing rulings that affected the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals. But it wasn't until the investigation into his judicial conduct that he truly began to understand the gravity of his mistakes. The first step toward redemption came when Judge Bennett was required to undergo sensitivity training, counseling, and reflection on his past decisions. It wasn't easy. Sitting through those sessions, listening to other people's stories of racial discrimination and unjust sentencing, was painful, but it was necessary. The man who had once felt untouchable, who had believed that the law was an unerring guide to justice, was now forced to reckon with the fact that his actions had perpetuated a system of racial inequality. In the privacy of his home, Judge Bennett often found himself staring at the walls, lost in thought. The harsh judgments he had passed on countless young men, most of them minorities, replayed in his mind. He began to realize that he had been blinded by his own prejudices that he had never acknowledged, let alone addressed. He had allowed his biases to dictate his rulings, and in doing so, he had destroyed the futures of young men like Elijah. The emotional toll was immense. Judge Bennett had always prided himself on his career, on the authority he held in the courtroom. Now, that career was in ruins. But it wasn't just his career that was at stake. It was his relationship with his daughter, Lily. He could no longer look at her with the same pride he once had. The trust she had placed in him had been shattered, and he knew that rebuilding that trust would take time, effort, and an acknowledgement of his wrongs. Patricia, his wife, stood by him during this time, though their relationship, too, was strained. She had always supported him, but now she found herself questioning his decisions. Still, she urged him to keep going, to face the truth and work toward making amends. She, too, had been hurt by the revelations, but she understood that healing could only come if they both confronted the past. Judge Bennett's journey toward redemption was slow and painful. It wasn't just about going through the motions of sensitivity training or issuing a public apology. It was about fundamentally changing the way he saw the world, the way he saw justice. He had been given a second chance, not just to restore his career, but to restore his integrity. In the quiet of his study, Judge Bennett realized that he could never undo the damage he had caused, but he could start by doing what was right from that moment forward. Redemption, he learned, was not a destination but a process, one that would require him to face his own flaws, take responsibility for his actions, and ultimately make amends for the lives he had affected. Elijah and Lily stood side by side at the front of a crowded conference room, the air thick with anticipation. The journey that had brought them here had been long and fraught with challenges, but today marked a pivotal moment in their lives and in their shared mission. It was a mission born out of injustice, pain, and loss, but it was also one fueled by hope, determination, and the belief that change was not only possible, but necessary. Their collaboration, while unlikely at first, had become the cornerstone of their work in juvenile justice reform. Elijah, having lived through the broken system, brought his personal experience and passion to the table. His time in juvenile detention had left scars, but it had also given him a unique insight into the flaws and injustices of the system. He knew firsthand how bias, poverty, and systemic failures could affect a young person's life, and he was determined to make sure no one else would have to suffer the same fate. Lily, on the other hand, had a different perspective. She had grown up surrounded by the law, with her father, a respected judge, instilling in her the belief that justice was something to be revered. But the truth she had uncovered about her father's actions had shaken her to the core, leading her to question everything she had once believed. Now, working with the Innocence Project, Lily was using her legal expertise to free wrongfully convicted juveniles, advocating for systemic change, and pushing for a rethinking of how young people were treated by the justice system. Their partnership had started as a way to make sense of their own pain. Elijah seeking a way to help others avoid the injustices he had suffered, and Lily seeking a way to atone for the sins of her father. But over time, their work together had evolved into something more. They had become a team, each learning from the other, each growing in their understanding of justice, empathy, and what it truly meant to fight for change. One of the most significant steps in their collaboration came when Lily received a grant to establish a legal clinic for juvenile defendants. This clinic would provide legal assistance, mentorship, and education for young people caught up in the justice system. The grant was a victory for Lily, and for Elijah, it felt like a recognition of their shared mission. The clinic was a tangible way to provide the support that so many young people, like he had once been, desperately needed. As Lily worked tirelessly to set up the clinic, Elijah focused on creating mentorship programs for at-risk youth. He knew that simply providing legal assistance wasn't enough. Young people needed guidance, support, and role models to help them navigate the often overwhelming challenges of growing up in a system that seemed stacked against them. Elijah visited local schools, detention centers, and community organizations, sharing his story, offering advice, and connecting with young people who needed someone to believe in them. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of frustration, when the weight of the system seemed too great to overcome. But together, Elijah and Lily found strength in each other. Their shared experiences, their shared pain, had been transformed into a shared mission. They were no longer just two individuals trying to fix their own lives. They were a team, working to fix a broken system. As they spent more time together, their bond deepened. They talked late into the night, sharing their hopes and fears, brainstorming ideas for reform, and supporting each other through the inevitable setbacks. Lily's quiet determination complemented Elijah's passionate drive, and Elijah's first-hand knowledge of the system gave Lily the perspective she needed to push for real change. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with. Their work began to gain recognition, and soon they were invited to speak at conferences, participate in panels, and meet with lawmakers who were interested in their ideas for juvenile justice reform. They had become voices of authority in the movement, not because they were experts, but because they had lived through the very system they were trying to change. But despite the progress they had made, neither Elijah nor Lily could forget the system's failures, the lives it had ruined, and the people who still needed help. For Elijah, it was a constant reminder of what was at stake. For Lily, it was a reminder of why she had to keep fighting, even when it seemed like the battle would never end. The courtroom doors had closed behind them, but Elijah Carter and Lily Foster had not yet reached their final destination. Their battle against a flawed system, a system that had once condemned Elijah and threatened to break them all, had only just begun. Together, they were about to lay the groundwork for something much bigger than themselves, a movement for change. The idea of a program had been in the air for months, but it wasn't until they stood side by side, at the head of a meeting room filled with justice reform advocates and community leaders, that it truly began to take shape. The weight of their shared mission was palpable, but there was also a sense of anticipation in the room, an energy that hinted at the possibility of real transformation. "I know what it's like to be written off by a system that was supposed to protect me," Elijah began, his voice strong but filled with the ghosts of his past. He stood at a podium before a room full of people who had gathered to hear his story, and the story of Lily Foster, a woman who had sacrificed her personal ties to stand up for what was right. Too many of our young people don't get a fair shot. They're judged not by their actions, but by the color of their skin, the neighborhood they come from, or a past that's often out of their control. The Second Chance Youth Justice Program will be a place where we fight that bias. A place where youth get not just a second chance, but a real opportunity. Lily nodded beside him, taking the floor with the same passion. This program will offer legal support, mentorship, and educational opportunities for young people at risk of being lost to the justice system. We will give them the tools to rise above the circumstances they were born into and fight for a future they deserve. The initiative was bold. It was personal. It was everything Elijah and Lily had lived through, the injustice, the suffering, and the eventual hope. But now it was about something bigger. It was about ensuring that the stories they'd experienced wouldn't be repeated. It was about rewriting the narrative for kids like Elijah, kids who had been failed by the system, but who could still rise if given the right support. As the meeting came to a close, Elijah and Lily knew that they weren't just planting seeds of change. They were creating an entirely new path forward for future generations, one where young people wouldn't be discarded based on their past mistakes, but embraced for the potential they held. Months later, the Second Chance Youth Justice Program began to take root, with Elijah and Lily working tirelessly to build momentum. But despite their efforts, a part of Elijah's healing journey still felt incomplete. There was a glaring hole, something they hadn't fully reckoned with yet: his relationship with Judge Charles Bennett. When Elijah received the call from Judge Bennett's office, he couldn't believe it at first. The once mighty judge, whose decisions had altered the course of Elijah's life forever, was reaching out, not to defend his actions, but to offer an apology. "I know it's been a long time, and I know that no words will undo what I did." Judge Bennett's voice was quiet over the phone. "But I'd like to meet Elijah. I want to make amends. I want to do what I can to help change the system I helped break." It wasn't easy. Elijah had spent years fighting the very man who now wanted to stand by his side. But as he looked at the work they had already done, helping kids like him, watching their program grow, he realized this was the moment for true reconciliation. If the program was going to work, it had to be built on a foundation of understanding, of change, not just in the system, but in the people who had once upheld it. When Judge Bennett arrived at the next meeting, he wasn't the same man who had sentenced Elijah. His suit was simpler, his posture more subdued. It wasn't the arrogance of a man who thought he was above reproach. It was a quiet humility, a recognition of the damage he had caused. "I've learned a lot over the past year," Judge Bennett began, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "I've come to understand that true justice isn't just about following the law. It's about seeing people, truly seeing them, for who they are. I've failed in that regard, and for that, I'm truly sorry." Elijah looked at him, unsure if he was ready to forgive. But in that moment, he realized something important. This wasn't about forgetting the past. It wasn't about erasing the hurt that had been caused. It was about moving forward, together, in the hope of creating something better. "I'm here," Judge Bennett continued, "to do whatever I can to help make things right. I want to help mentor these young people. I want to be part of the solution." It was an unexpected move. A man who had once been the symbol of authority, now humbled and standing beside those he had once harmed. But for Elijah, it was proof that change was possible, even for someone like the judge who had seemed beyond redemption. Together, they moved forward, adding the weight of Judge Bennett's involvement to the program's credibility. His presence wasn't just symbolic, it was real. He was a man trying to repair the damage he had caused, trying to atone for his role in a system that had failed so many. Forgiveness was never going to come easy. For Elijah, healing was an ongoing journey, a constant process of confronting his trauma, of facing the ghosts of his past while working toward a better future. His relationship with his mother, Linda, had deepened over time, and she had been there for him every step of the way. Together, they had survived a broken system, and now they were watching as Elijah, once a boy confined to a cell, stood before audiences, helping other young people avoid the same fate. For Lily, the weight of what she had done, exposing her father's wrongdoings to the world, was not something she could easily forget. But over time, she began to see the bigger picture. She realized that her decision had not only led to reform, but it had also opened the door for a new, more honest relationship with her father, one where they could work together for change instead of fighting against each other. Their mutual respect grew as they continued their work in the program, forging a bond stronger than any they had before. The shared mission to heal and rebuild the lives of those affected by the justice system kept them moving forward, despite the scars of the past. Judge Bennett, too, worked to repair his relationships. His wife, Patricia, had stood by him throughout the storm, but their marriage was fragile, strained by years of him being closed off to the world. Slowly, though, there were signs of healing. They began to talk again, truly talk, about their past, their mistakes, and their hopes for the future. The road to forgiveness wasn't quick or easy, but as they all worked together, side by side, it became clear that real healing was possible. Not just for Elijah, not just for Lily, but for all of them. For the entire justice system, which was, little by little, beginning to change. As time passed, the echoes of Elijah and Lily's work reverberated far beyond their immediate circles. What began as a personal mission, born of pain, injustice, and a relentless desire for change, soon grew into a movement that would inspire entire communities, challenge entrenched systems, and spark a broader conversation about justice and fairness. It wasn't just the Second Chance Youth Justice Program that flourished, although that initiative alone was already making waves. Lily's efforts in overturning wrongful convictions gained national attention, and Elijah's mentorship program became a model for similar initiatives across the country. From the smallest grassroots organizations to policymakers in Washington, the impact of their work reached into the very fabric of the criminal justice system. Lily's role in the Innocence Project grew exponentially. Her legal expertise, combined with the compassion she had cultivated through her own personal journey, allowed her to see the humanity behind every case she took on. With each wrongful conviction overturned, she not only righted a legal wrong but also healed a small part of the broken trust that had existed between communities of color and the justice system. Elijah, too, became a beacon of hope. His story, once one of despair, was now a testament to resilience and change. His mentorship program flourished as it gave young people who had been written off by society a new path, a path paved with hope, education, and the possibility of a different future. Through his program, Elijah was teaching them not just how to survive, but how to thrive. His efforts created a ripple effect, inspiring others to invest in the potential of marginalized youth, offering them second chances that could radically alter their life trajectories. The success of Elijah and Lily's initiatives was evident in the changing mindset of many who had once stood on the sidelines. Judges, lawmakers, and citizens began to rethink the way they viewed juvenile justice. More courts were instituting sensitivity training, acknowledging the deep-rooted racial biases that had influenced their rulings for generations. Police departments, too, began to reassess their treatment of young people of color. It was clear. Change was happening, but it was still fragile. The road ahead was long, and the forces of inertia in the justice system remained formidable. But for the first time in a generation, there was hope that real reform could come. The work of Elijah and Lily had given people the courage to believe that the justice system could, indeed, be just. The final scene was a testament to the journey that Elijah and Lily had embarked upon, one that neither of them could have predicted when they first met under such dark circumstances. They stood side by side at the National Juvenile Justice Reform Conference. The room was packed, and the energy was electric. Elijah, now an accomplished speaker and advocate, was no longer the young man who had once been locked away in juvenile detention. His face was one of confidence, the product of years of hard work, healing, and self-discovery. Lily, too, had transformed. No longer just the daughter of a disgraced judge, she was now a leader in the fight for justice, her every word a call to action. They had spent years leading workshops, speaking at events, and collaborating with experts in the field, but this moment was different. It was a culmination of everything they had worked for, a recognition not just of their individual accomplishments, but of the collective impact they had made in the world of juvenile justice reform. As the audience gave them a standing ovation, Lily and Elijah exchanged a quiet smile. It was a moment of pride, but also a moment of reflection. They had come so far, but they knew that the work was far from done. They were no longer just advocates for the wrongfully convicted or for marginalized youth. They were symbols of the transformative power of truth, forgiveness, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Their paths had intertwined in ways neither could have imagined, but it was this very intersection of their lives that had created the foundation for the legacy they were building. Together, they had proven that even the most deeply entrenched systems of injustice could be challenged, one step at a time. And that, perhaps, was their greatest achievement. The conference ended, but their journey continued. As they walked out of the room, heads held high, they knew that the future of justice was not just in their hands, but in the hands of all those they had inspired. Young people like Elijah, people who had been written off, were now showing up as leaders in their communities, advocating for a better future. Lily's legal clinic continued to grow, helping to overturn countless unjust convictions. The work they had started had begun to take on a life of its own, and they were merely the catalysts for something much larger. As Elijah and Lily's story unfolds, it carries with it powerful lessons that resonate deeply with the issues facing our justice system today. One of the most important lessons is the idea that the justice system, as it currently stands, is deeply flawed. It is a system that, for too long, has disproportionately affected marginalized communities, particularly Black and Latino youth. We see this reflected in the overrepresentation of young people of color in juvenile detention centers and the systemic racial biases that often lead to their disproportionate punishment. The story of Elijah Carter is, unfortunately, not unique. Every day, young people across the country are subjected to the same injustices, often because they were born into circumstances that they had no control over. But Elijah's journey also shows us the power of redemption and transformation. The truth is, people can change. The system may be broken, but the individuals within it can still work to heal, to atone for their mistakes, and to contribute to a better future. This is something Judge Bennett's story exemplifies. Although his past actions cannot be undone, his willingness to confront his biases and work for systemic change represents the potential for growth and healing, even for those who have perpetuated the injustices in the first place. Finally, the story of Lily and Elijah teaches us that hope, while often hard to come by, is the key to driving change. It was their hope, not just for themselves, but for the countless young people who would come after them, that fueled their fight. The lesson here is clear. We must never lose hope in the possibility of change. Even when it feels like we're up against a system that is too large to overcome, we must continue to push forward. We must demand better for those who have been failed. As the years continue to pass, Elijah and Lily's legacy grows. Their work has inspired new movements, new leaders, and a generation of young people who now know that justice is not just something to be hoped for. It is something that can be fought for and won. But the work is far from over. There will always be new battles to face, new challenges to overcome, and new injustices to address. But if there's one thing that Elijah, Lily, and Judge Bennett have learned, it's that true change comes not in giant leaps, but in the steady, persistent work of individuals who refuse to accept the status quo. It comes from the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, to acknowledge past wrongs, and to fight tirelessly for the future. And with that, the story of Elijah, Lily, and Judge Bennett doesn't just end with a transformation of the justice system. It ends with a call to action. The road to justice may be long and winding, but as they've proven, it is always worth the journey. Thank you so much for listening to the entire story. Your time and attention mean the world to us. If you were inspired by this journey and want to hear more stories of change, hope, and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on the next one. Stay tuned and keep believing in the power of transformation.